Welcome to the Bioinformatics CRO podcast. I'm Grant Belgard, and joining me today is Lucas Steuber. Lucas, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. First of all, thanks so much for having me, Grant. I appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on.
This is a cool topic for a podcast, right? Bioinformatics is one of those niches within a niche. It's really cool to, I think, have opportunities to learn more about and to share what we're working on. So I think, like a lot of folks, I've had a bit of a twisty-turny journey to where I've ended up professionally. I was originally a computer science and business major at the University of Oregon years ago, and had a lot of expectations from my family in terms of you're going to be a businessman, and this is what you're going to do. And I already sort of had snuck in the computer science element. And to my great chagrin, they forced me to take some classes outside of my major strand one year, right? This sort of cluster idea of okay, you need to go experience some other things. And I was kind of like, why am I doing this? And so I signed up for some courses in linguistics. And I literally think that it was because I could sleep in, the ones that I chose, right? It was kind of, oh, good, my Tuesday, Thursday, I can get to campus at 10. And just really immediately fell in love. I had always been really into computer science and math from kind of a structural basis. I really like the sort of elegance of taking something really complex and watching it sort of sort itself out into a simple solution, or making noise from the chaos, so to speak. Language, I found, has a lot of that same element. It really is math in a fundamental sense. There's structure and syntax and all these different things. So I ended up getting a bachelor's and a master's in applied linguistics, studying language structure when it's disordered, right? So looking at schizophrenia specifically, and some other situations where language starts to break down. And then decided I didn't have enough student loan debt, and so went back and became a speech-language pathologist. So it's funny, when I'm on airplanes now and people ask me what I do, the two job titles are basically speech-language pathologist and product manager, or brain-computer interface product manager. And I don't want to explain either of those two things, so I just end up wanting to make something up, I'm a real estate agent, I don't know, go to sleep. So in any event, I worked clinically as a speech-language pathologist with a specialty in low-incidence populations, so we would call these orphan disorders or rare disorders, folks that really require the use of assistive technology, and specifically in our case, augmentative and alternative communication, which most people tend to think of Stephen Hawking as kind of the cardinal example of somebody who used assistive technology to speak. So I've been in the industry now designing and building those systems for about the last 9 years, and I work now as sort of heading up clinical and marketing for a company called Cognixion, which is a brain-computer interface startup out of the Santa Barbara area, although we also have offices in Toronto. So there's a lot of sort of deep learning and analysis that goes into this from not bioinformatics in sort of the genetic standpoint, but certainly harnessing, I guess, the signal out of the noise from a lot of, biological data. And so that's what drew me to this podcast, and I'm excited to be here and talk more about it.
Fantastic. Thanks for coming on. Yeah, we're really happy to have you here. So, and just for our listeners, that's Cognixion spelled with an X. So we'll have a transcript on the website where you can link out to the website. Yeah, tell us about your product.
Yeah, so this has been sort of a stealth thing for the past couple of years. What it is it's a coupled brain-computer interface with an augmented reality display. So, or like we call it, mixed reality is sort of becoming the new term. It's not as complicated as it sounds from a use perspective. So let me put that out ahead of time. Just to frame the conversation a little bit, there are a ton of people in the world, and specifically in the United States, that can benefit from augmentative communication. But it's largely an invisible population, right? I sort of call this the silent minority. According to the best of my math, only something like 7% of the people who could benefit from augmentative communication are even aware that it exists, right? So there's a lot of people with, say, cerebral palsy, or that have had a bulbar stroke, or have a locked-in condition, or maybe have been paralyzed in an accident. These are all people that we don't really sort of see out in our daily lives, right? A lot of them are in care facilities or in their homes, and very often without the ability to speak. The industry of augmentative communication has largely been focused on tablet-based sort of touch solutions in the last couple of years. So certainly for children with autism, that sort of thing, where there isn't any sort of motor disability. So they're still able to touch and interact with like an iPad. Or then eye gaze. So, and the cardinal company in that, I was the director of product for some time for Toby, which is well known in the sort of eye gaze world, which is really also sort of a bioinformatics sort of platform, just in a more structural reflectometry, measuring gaze using IR light. But that still doesn't meet the needs of this other population of folks that maybe either have too much movement to be adequately tracked by eye gaze. So the example would be like spastic CP, if you have a lot of chorea, which is sort of like involuntary movement, you're all over the place. Or then the opposite, if you late stage ALS or folks that are totally locked in after a stroke, things like that currently really don't have a means to communicate. So what our product does is it presents a language and sort of home control interface in the augmented reality environment, and then measures using electrodes on the occipital lobe, on the rear of the head. It measures evoked potentials, specifically visually evoked potentials, or SSVEPs to define it, which in evoked potential, really it's like, think of being pinched, right? If somebody like pinched you in your arm, that would cause like a spike in, the specific sort of part of your brain that's measuring pain or tactile sort of experience in that part of your body. What we're doing is the same thing from a visual standpoint. So the different interface elements in the AR environment basically fluctuate or have different frequencies to them, say 5 hertz, 8 hertz, 12 hertz. And depending on what somebody's fixated on, we can measure then the evoked potential that spikes in their occipital lobe to associate that then with intent and make a selection. So it's been really cool. There's a lot of signal to noise sort of questions around it, which I can go into, but that's sort of the rough path.
It's really interesting. So are the people essentially being shown different, say, letters, for example, at different frequencies, and you're effectively measuring attention?
Yep, absolutely. And I like the way you said attention, like there is a distinction between gaze and fixation in this sense. So like, for example, if somebody's unable to move their eyes, we can still detect what they're attending to within their peripheral vision. So it is very much an attention instead of like explicitly looking at something like in an eye gaze modality. And yes, so it has to do with the frequency of the elements. There is sort of a threshold at which the sort of noise becomes too much, right? So one of the things we're working on is trying to have as many interactive elements as possible within that, with the ultimate goal of getting to like a full QWERTY keyboard, where somebody can type out. We're working towards that. We're not quite there yet. Right now, we have, for example, something called a linotype keyboard, which is you sort of dive in based on frequency of letters within like a sort of a subset of the alphabet, and then sort of can back up. And we do a lot of things in terms of natural language processing and prediction and context awareness to try to predict the right stuff. And then we also have like a pre-built phrase inventory that's relevant to certain contexts, medical needs, social needs, stuff like that, as kind of a starting point. But then really we anticipate everyone's going to customize that and add their own phrases and stuff, right? You can't predict what everybody wants to say. I think one of the reasons why I love this field is that it sort of combines a lot of different disciplines, right? I mean, we have obviously this sort of clinical healthcare component, but then we also have a really deep sort of language and linguistic research component. And then we have the BCI and all these other sort of like interesting engineering questions. So there's never a dull moment.
So out of all these challenges, what do you think is the most difficult?
It's tough. It's tough to answer. I think that I'm going to go with 2 of them. Well, 3 of them. Can I give you 3? I'll give you 3 equal challenges. So one of them is the design of the language system, right? So one of the issues with these historically has been that what we do is we provide people with sort of an inventory of what we want them to say, rather than giving them the flexibility to say what they really want to say, which, in Chomsky's terms would be like the infinite generability of language. The fact that you can say anything in English, you can make a sentence of infinite length with all these sort of modifiers and different things. That's hard to capture when you're working with a UX where maybe you're constrained to something like 8 interactive elements, right? So we don't want to make people have to dive 30 pages deep or paginate for an hour in order to find these pre-programmed things. What we want to do is increase their rate of production as much as possible using like intelligence based on their context or prediction and this other stuff. And so it's been a challenge because language prediction and language generally is not very well understood, even among neurotypical populations. But then you think about like the specific needs that someone with ALS or CP or Rett syndrome might have. And it's been a really interesting journey, like working with the community and having actual users of augmentative communication, sort of vet these out for us and give us feedback. So we have about 100 users that work with us on the development of the language model. And that's one of our sort of core principles is nothing for us without us, right? So keeping all those folks involved. The second one I would say is the sort of signal to noise question. And the analogy I guess I would have is the hearing aid industry, which is really big, by the way. There's like billion-dollar companies that are making hearing aids. And from a consumer standpoint, they're under a lot of pressure to increase battery life and decrease size of the devices. But they also are under a lot of pressure to improve their like far field sound detection and differentiation between people like sitting close to you. Like I remember my grandfather had hearing aids like 20 years ago, and it just amplified everything, right? So if you're in a crowded room, you just basically can't hear anything because you hear everything all at once. And so there's just a ton of algorithm work that has gone into trying to be like, okay, like who are we actually listening to here? Let's tune out all the rest, while also dealing with battery constraint and firmware and everything else. And that's really similar, right? Because we get all this electric data from the brain, and we're really sort of looking for this one little needle in that haystack, right? And everything else can go away. And so, meanwhile, we need to make something that's wearable and portable and durable and, has adequate battery life to work all day. That's, I think, been the balance and the trade-off why we've been working all year or for several years. If this were an invasive solution, like Elon Musk, for example, with Neuralink, a lot of those questions become a lot easier. But we really didn't want something invasive. We wanted something that you could just sort of put on and take off. And then the third piece of challenge, which is yet to be sort of fully vetted out, is just explaining it. When you think of these folks that maybe have ALS, this might be, your 70-year-old grandfather who isn't particularly computer proficient, right? And suddenly we're asking him to be a cyborg with this brain-computer interface. So if you're a 20-year-old with a CP or a 40-year-old with ALS, I think those folks are a lot sort of more caught up with modern technology and are willing to sort of expect and experiment with the environment. One of my jobs over the next few months is to be preparing all these materials and webinars and everything else to try to show everyone why this is valuable for them at any age.
It's really interesting. So how far do you think non-invasive methods can be pushed?
So there is sort of a theoretical threshold that's been established in research of, like, if we're looking specifically at the keyboard access use case, there was an article published recently arguing basically that 30 words per minute is about what we're going to get in terms of being able to sort out intentionality from specifically the occipital use case.
30 words per minute's not bad.
Yeah, it's not, right? And that's about the rate that most people text. It's a little bit slower than typical conversational rapport, which is really what we sort of want to get to. And so we scaffold that a bit with things like the pre-built phrases. But that's our goal, is to get to that point. I think that it's probably premature to say that we have a hard and fast threshold, right? Like that's just, famous last words, right? Because somebody's going to come up with a better electrode or somebody's going to come up with a better algorithm. And if we didn't have the constraints on battery and firmware, like if we could hook somebody up to a mainframe with these, we could easily exceed that, right? But we're trying to build something that's compact and portable. I'm confident that things will evolve, and I'm confident they'll evolve in such a way that, I think it's at some point the distinction between invasive and non-invasive for this sort of measurement is probably going to be moot. We're probably still 10 years away from that.
And how does the learning curve look for people as they start to use this? Where it's their first day versus they're a month in versus they're a year in. How much difference do you see in speed?
Yeah, right. So that's a big subject, obviously, of the clinical trials and user testing and human factors that we've been doing now for quite some time and will continue to do. We still have 3 more iterations of that testing before the first version of the product goes to launch, which will be in early summer. This is a kind of a cop-out answer, but I'd have to say it depends. I think that folks that are used to, for example, even just a QWERTY keyboard interface, right? Those folks, that maybe have just had a cell phone and been texting or computer literate to begin with, they're going to move pretty quickly through being able to do this. Like I can almost hit that 30 words per minute threshold myself right now. And we found that to be consistently true for folks with ALS that are familiar with computers, folks with CP, myasthenia gravis, supranuclear palsies, all these different things. Basically, if you are a literate adult who then goes through a transition into needing to use this, the pickup period is pretty quick. There are 2 exceptions to that. One of them is the sort of older adult who maybe doesn't have a lot of experience with, sort of typing in an electronic environment, right? And so there's a little bit extra there in terms of just, I guess, what we would call operational competence, knowing how the thing might work or how you want it to work and that it needs to be charged and all these basics. And then at the other end would be, this population, like Rett syndrome is a really good example. So Rett syndrome is a rare disease that only affects women. It tends to cause paralysis kind of from the waist up. And it has an onset of around between 3 to 5 years old, typically, is when these diagnoses occur. And so there's a lot of girls out there with Rett syndrome that I've worked with personally that maybe haven't had a communication system their entire life, or have been doing something like, somebody holds up a piece of plexiglass with words written on it and they try to guess what the person's looking at, that sort of thing. And when we catch them at 16 or 18 years old, there can be a little bit of a learning curve there too, because they haven't even necessarily been exposed to written language in a sort of authorship sort of capacity. So that's one of the things we think about too, is how to scaffold people up to literacy. Maybe never just were exposed because of their disability.
It's interesting. Long term, do you see any non-medical applications for this kind of technology?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I think that's where most of the market is focused, right? Especially when it comes to the augmented reality use case. I mean, a lot of people are looking at industrial applications, but also entertainment stuff. I know one of the companies we work with just licensed their lens technology also to the Super Mario Land sort of themed thing in Disney World. And so there's all kinds of cool stuff going on with it. So within medicine, there's stuff that I haven't even addressed, right? So there's the concept of therapeutics for Alzheimer's using this. There's the concept of diagnostics. All of that those are outside of our use case, but are really, really interesting. And then beyond that, one of the things we've done, and Amazon has been really, really gracious with us. We use a lot of their sort of back end for our computing and for privacy reasons and things like that. But they've also enabled us to embed Alexa, as a virtual assistant, which is cool because you don't actually need to own an Alexa. It actually is an Alexa hub itself. And there have been times when, for example, my voice assistant is in our kitchen and my wife was cooking a few weeks ago and it couldn't hear me. There was too much other noise. And I was like, man, I wish I just had the wearable and I could just tell it with my brain, turn off the lights. So, I mean, I absolutely think that stuff is coming.
Where do you think the first applications will be?
It's interesting to look at who's most interested versus what sort of gets actualized first. We, for example, have a ton of interest and a lot of inquiries from gaming companies, right, who are interested not just as a control modality, but also, and this is something that I worked with at Toby a fair amount, training and measurement for professional video game players of what were you looking at when you did this play, or what were you thinking about, those sorts of things. However, that's really not where we see the first investment happening. I think the first investment is much more industrial and, and medical in another sense, right? So remote surgical tools, things like that. But if you think of it as, almost as just a separate access modality, there might be somebody who is interacting with, let's say, a remote surgical tool, and they have a mouse and they've got a right click and a left click and you got a keyboard in front of them, but now they also have this totally other modality where they can interact in sort of a third way, even just to zoom in on a piece of what they're looking at or whatever, using the brain-computer interface component. I see that stuff coming, and I also see it for a neurotypical audience not even being that expensive. Just the pure brain-computer interface stuff is probably going to become pretty popular. I mean, you look at stuff like Muse now, these companies that are offering meditation awareness. That's all fundamentally the same sort of technology, just applied at a different scale. So it's going to be really cool to watch. I think that we're going to see a real revolution in terms of what these things can offer us over the next 5 to 10 years.
Going back to the medical applications, you talked about therapeutics. How could something like this have a therapeutic use? Can you discuss that?
Yeah, sure. So there's some evidence, for example, that in Alzheimer's specifically, as well as in certain visual impairments, that specific frequencies of the steady state visual elements might actually, in one case, break up plaques, in another case, serve as sort of a training and attention mechanism for people that maybe have cognitive impairments or attention impairments in terms of attending to their entire field of view. We have a lot of folks that are interested in using our hardware for that, and that's one thing I'll say is that I'm a speech language pathologist. My role has been, to build this for our initial use case, which is augmentative communication, but we also do see this as a platform for other folks, if people want to develop on top of it. The reason why, frankly, we're not jumping into diagnostics ourselves right off the bat is just as a result of the FDA sort of requirements that would be involved with that. We are a startup. We're honing in on something that we know we can do really, really well.
Start with the tractable use case for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
And can you maybe discuss diagnostics a bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that have been shown to be diagnostic from specifically an EEG use case. So, I mean, one of them that I'll just throw out there as a metric that we measure is fatigue. You know, if we have somebody who's using the device for a long period of time, we are able to tell that's kind of wearing them down. And one thing that we could do, for example, is to simplify the user interface or bring the interactive elements closer together so there's not as much range of motion or attention involved. We're looking at all those things. There's ethics that come into play there too. It's like, I don't want to be like, you're tired, now you can't use language. Shush, you know. We need to sort of balance what we're doing. You know, fatigue is sort of like an in-the-moment thing that's relatively easy. More complex things would be actually tracking the rate of neurodegenerative diseases and prognosis in that regard, of which there is compelling evidence for ALS, for Parkinson's, for Alzheimer's, that all could be possible. But it's still pretty exploratory, right? There isn't like a clear blueprint of X plus Y equals Z at this point. But we're certainly willing to throw this tool into the mix in terms of something else that people can experiment with.
So if you were to speculate way out 50 years, what do you think will be the long-term implications of this kind of technology? You're writing a sci-fi story involving brain-computer interface, non-invasive brain-computer interface technology with AR.
You know, it's funny you asked that question. So I've been listening to Ready Player 2, the audiobook. You know, I don't know if Ernest Cline, he wrote Ready Player 1 and they made a movie out of it, Steven Spielberg. But so listening to Ready Player 2, and literally the premise of the book is about the first non-invasive BCI AR. And I to the point where I was walking to work and I'm looking around like, is somebody listening to me? I thought I signed an NDA about all this. Like, how are they? So other people are thinking about it absolutely in the science fiction context, and you know his take is a little bit dystopian, and it's you know that people sort of come to enjoy this BCI mixed reality environment more than life itself, right? So they sort of dive into it wholesale. For better or for worse, I can assure you we're not there yet. You know, there's all kinds of other evoked potentials that they could be explored. You know, taste, sound, haptics. In the novel, all of that is sort of complete, and we're really still looking at visuals. But I would say that there's probably two futures I see. One of them in terms of the assistive technology use cases, I really feel like we're moving towards a future where accessibility is going to become synonymous with personalization, which is very much something that I want, right? You know, there's a quote that I love that's, for some people, technology makes things easier, but for others, technology makes things possible. I really want to just sort of raise the bar in assistive tech and establish this as the new standard moving forward, is that we should be looking at all of these things, not just BCI, but also just the context of life and use and in whatever form we can get it. And then for society generally, you know, it's going to be really interesting to see. I see all these sort of hypotheticals come up. Obviously, there is immense military application, right, which is a whole other conversation in and of itself. But there's also application as we look towards autonomous vehicles. If you would have asked me 5 years ago, I never would have guessed that this meditation use case would be as popular as it is. But people really like the sort of monitoring of their emotional state and getting that feedback. And so it would not surprise me at all if a BCI wearable in some form became a pretty common piece of technology for people to have in the 10-year window.
Interesting. And what do you think are the military use cases?
Yeah, right. Coming from the eye gaze tracking field, there was a lot of military interest in that realm as well. So I can speak to it pretty comprehensively from that perspective. We have not here worked with military directly, although we have had conversations with various space agencies. But I think it sort of comes back to the idea of having that other access modality, right? So if your hands are tied up flying that jet with 600 other things you got to do, and the jet is able to infer what you are attending to, whether that's a threat or simply something within the cockpit interface. I mean, that adds another layer of really interesting data, not only in terms of what it can do in the moment for predicting what needs to be done by the jet, but also in sort of post-flight analysis. If something went really right or something went really wrong, how can we sort of harness the intentionality of the pilot to either repeat or prevent that from happening again? And I think a lot of that translates into the space use case as well. So I'll be really interested to see what people come up with, frankly.
Seems a bit like the possibilities are limitless.
Yeah, right. Well, it's this whole other sort of measurement that we sort of haven't had access to, at least not at a consumer scale before. One of the sayings in linguistics that I was sort of raised with in all my college training was that the only measurement of cognition is language and behavior, right? We sort of can't look into someone's head. We can only see what they say and how they, what they do in order to measure what's happening up there. And that's kind of changing, right? I mean, I wouldn't say that we're reading words directly, but we can definitely get a really clear sense of at least what people are looking at and paying attention to at any given moment. And I think that's, pretty telling often in terms of their behavior. I would love to hear from anybody listening. I mean, this is, again, it's so cool to have podcasts like this that focus in on something really specific like bioinformatics, because I'm sure there's a lot that I have even missed in terms of talking about this, and I'd love to hear ideas. So again, it's cognixion.com, Cognixion, and there's a whole long story I won't go into in terms of why that's the spelling, but it means things. And my name's Lucas Steuber. I'd love to hear from you, Lucas at cognixion.com. Any sort of thoughts or interests people might have. I guess my sort of final bit is that I think we're the first that has blended the BCI and the AR modality, or at least the first to market. It wouldn't surprise me at all if other people are working on it, but we won't be the last. I think that the disability use case is one that's really compelling for me, and it's one that's going to really benefit a lot of people around the world. But it's also sort of a harbinger of what's to come, right? I think that everyone is going to be looking at and talking about devices like this a lot more in the next 20 years. It's going to be great to watch.
Thanks so much for joining us, Lucas.
Thanks for your time.
It's a lot of fun.